The Tasmanian-pattern axe, or the Tassie as it is more popularly known, is the only axe pattern to have originated in Australia in modern times. Today, it is one of the most widely collected and appreciated axe patterns in the world. This is in part due to the fact that it was also inseparable from the origins of competitive woodchopping, and the Tasmanian-pattern axe design is the basis of the racing axe. In spite of its popularity and its role in the development of competitive woodchopping, the Tasmanian-pattern axe is very little understood in its history and origins. These origins remain somewhat obscure today, and it's necessary to dig very deeply into newspapers and other kinds of historical sources from the 1880s and the 1890s to discover the true origins of this axe. And in this video, that is exactly what I want to do. In the earliest period of the Tasmanian colony around Hobart, the earliest logging operations were carried out by convict labour forces. Because, of course, there were penal colonies in Tasmania in the early days, and convict labour was used as slave labour. The convicts were seen as pretty much expendable, and they were naturally not equipped with the best quality tools to carry out logging. And you can imagine that if somebody had a tree fall on them, or somebody had an accident, or somebody just keeled over from being overworked, they just replaced that man, with another convict. And it was impossible for tools to evolve and improve and develop because nobody really gave a damn about the efficiency of tools when human labor was regarded in this way as kind of expendable slave labor. The axes that the convicts were equipped with were similar sorts of axes that the very early colonists brought with them in the late 18th century, the early 19th century, from Britain. Typically, they were very traditional tools which had been used in Britain for centuries. Things like the broad axe. I mean, it's amazing to think that people actually tried to cut down gum trees with a broadaxe as in a hewing axe. They actually did that because that's all they had. Imagine trying to cut down a gum tree with a broadaxe. They had the Kent pattern, and the Kent pattern's a good utilitarian axe when you're cutting up kindling and doing that sort of stuff. But the Kent pattern isn't much good when you're trying to cut down really hard, tough wood, old growth trees. And they had long bit felling axes, which there are catalogues I've seen where the Kent pattern and the long bit felling axe were described as Australian patterns or colonial patterns. But they were very, very similar axes to the traditional British axes, and they just didn't work in Australian conditions really at all. And if they did work, they still were very inefficient tools compared to what came later. And the main felling tool was the crosscut saw. And the crosscut saw, because the axes were so inefficient in Australian conditions that people had, the crosscut saw for probably until the 1860s, 70s, 1880s, the crosscut saw was the main tool for logging. It was only later with some of the American axes before the Tassie, and then the coming of the Tassie, that the axe became more the preeminent logging tool, even more than the crosscut saw. So it wasn't until later, when the typical worker logging in the forest was a free man rather than a convict, that the efficiency of tools started to be thought about, and a process began to be underway to develop tools which were suitable for Australian conditions. H.A. Nichols, a figure that we will return to and discuss quite a few times during this video, was, among many other things, a professional journalist, and he wrote the following on the lives and the character of early timbermen in northern Tasmania. To understand the sport, it will be necessary first to describe the conditions under which the competitors live. The majority are either settlers cutting out homes for themselves, or men earning their living by felling timber for sawmills, by splitting timber into post rails or palings, or by felling the scrub by contract for the more wealthy class of selectors who are making clearings in the forests, or as it is locally called, the bush. Many of the settlers had but little education owing to their distance from schools. Hence, literary pursuits were denied them. Their best loved weapon was the axe, and the pioneer of pioneers was as much beloved as the Highland soldier loves his bayonet. Their talk was mainly of axes and saws, and who excelled in their use. Therefore, a spirit of rivalry arose which led to private matches to see who could cut a given size log in the quickest time. While it can be truthfully said that the Tasmanian-pattern axe design was not the product of one man's work, but rather many people were involved in working out the design, if any one person can be remembered as the father of the Tassie, it is definitely Hubert Allen Nichols. Hubert Nichols was an axeman, a competitive woodchopper in his younger days. And in the days when he was a bushman cutting timber in the forest, he suffered a serious injury, which turned out to be quite fateful in the story of the Tasmanian-pattern axe. When he was working in the bush one day, a dray being hauled by a bullock team ran over his arm with the wheel of the dray. And it caused such a severe injury that it effectively put an end to his career, not only as a competitive woodchopper, but also to any career involving any form of strenuous physical labor, which was, very much the typical kind of work that a man like that would have expected to do in his life. So Nichols, subsequent to that injury, looked for other ways to make a living. And one of his careers was as a journalist. Later, he had a political career. He was a justice of the peace. He fulfilled a number of different roles in the region of Latrobe in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. But while performing these other jobs and contributions to society, he never lost his love of axes and competitive wood chopping. He clearly had a real passionate love for this subject. And ultimately, he channeled his energies into the effort to lay the groundwork for organised competitive woodchopping as a sport, which at the time was something very new. To this end, it was H.A. Nichols who formed the United Australasian Axemen's Association in 1891. And this took place at what turned out to be the unofficial hangout of the association, which was an establishment called Whitaker's Coffee Palace in Gilbert Street, Latrobe. There's some irony to the fact that an iconic bit of Australian culture like the Tasmanian-pattern axe was founded not in a pub, but in what they used to call a coffee palace, which was something which was favoured by uh, campaigners against drunkenness and alcohol, basically, in society. And I think that Nichols probably chose this location rather than a pub so that some kind of real work and some kind of real productive outcome could be achieved from the meetings of the association rather than just boozing. Now, the United Australasian Axemen's Association was the first such association formed for axemen in Australia. And Nichols had a very particular idea when he founded the association. He did not only found it, as might be assumed, for the purpose of regulating wood chopping contests, because that kind of formal regulation so far had not existed in the sport. It was quite informal, and to lay down a set of rules. But he had another agenda as well, or another objective, which was, in his words, to demonstrate the skills of the settlers in the use of the axe, saw, splitting knife, and other tools, and to further their use through competition. Hubert Allen Nichols formed the United Australasian Axemen's Association in 1891, as we've already seen. And this formation coincided with the first open wood chopping contest ever held. And this was staged by Nichols and the association members at Latrobe, Tasmania, in that same year. Now, I've already mentioned that Nichols had a concept behind founding the association, which was to establish rules and a formal way of doing things in this new sport of competitive wood chopping. But he also wanted to try to work on improving the quality of tools for Australian conditions. The historian and the axeman Val Quanchi has said that with the formation of the association, competitors became increasingly interested in the possibility of improving these tools for everyday use as well as for competition. And that's a really important observation, that behind this new sport, this competitive sport of wood chopping, was the idea that maybe through this competition, new tools would be developed, new designs would be developed, which would be better than the ones that were used before, especially for use in Australia and in the colony of Tasmania. So, to this end, H.A. Nichols, having formed the association, the UAAA, and having already staged the first open wood chopping contest, he then moved ahead with the objective of designing a new axe pattern specifically for Australia. And this axe pattern would be used not only for competitive wood chopping, but also for general use. One of the things that axe makers were thinking about at this time in the early 1890s was developing what they called the ultimate axe. And there were a few different makers coming up with axe designs which were pretty innovative and trying to push axe design further and further forward. And I think the thinking behind what became the Tasmanian-pattern axe was partially related to that. This feeling that the tool could be made better, could be improved, could be developed further with new ideas. Now, at that time in Australia, Plumb was already a very popular axe maker, and another was Underhill. The axes which were used at that time for competitive wood chopping did not really resemble the Tasmanian pattern as we know it today very closely. They had some features which can be related to the Tassie, what became the Tassie, but they really were not close in design to what became the Tasmanian-pattern axe. So what happened was that H.A. Nichols and the association staged a meeting in the year following the first ever open wood chopping contest in Latrobe in 1891. So in 1892, they held a meeting again at their hangout at Whitaker's Coffee Palace in Gilbert Street. And they had called for a number of contributions from axemen, axe designers, people with ideas about how axe design could be improved. And it was in November of 1892 that the meeting was held. Prior to this meeting taking place at Whitaker's Coffee Palace, the United Australasian Axemen's Association had engaged in correspondence with a publication called the Australasian Ironmonger. And I'll come back to that later, but they were involved in this project as well. Now, people submitted different ideas, different designs to the meeting, and these were all laid out on a table, and the members of the association sat around the table and assessed the different contributions. These took the form of paper cutout models, fully made axes, fully designed axes. All kinds of different designs and axe heads and all sorts of things were laid out on the table in front of the men there. And they assessed each one in turn and decided what they liked and what they didn't like about the contributions that were made. All of these different contributions were considered and compared to one another. And they were also related to the axe, which at that time the competitive wood chopping men regarded in Tasmania as the best axe which they had used so far, the closest to the most advanced axe design for Australian conditions, for the conditions in Tasmania where they were, that they had ever used. And that axe was one made by the American maker Underhill. And it was painted with a bronze coloured paint. So they called it the Bronze Underhill axe. So they looked at the different contributions that had been made, and they looked at the Underhill bronze axe, which they regarded as their favourite. And they decided, based on the contributions and on the Underhill axe, what changes they would like to make to improve axe design and which things they would like to keep. And all of the men made their assessment, and ultimately they came up with a design. They came up with an ideal set of measurements and proportions, which they all eventually agreed on, probably with Nichols leading the discussion, I imagine. He was the secretary of the association. Now, Val Quanchi has summarised the proportions that they decided upon for this axe that they regarded as what would be the ultimate axe design for their own conditions. And he wrote, participants illustrated their ideas in various ways, ranging from complete axes ground ready to use to paper models. After much discussion, the ideal axe was proposed. It was to have a blade 5¼ to 5½ inches wide, a total depth of 7½ inches, a 1/2 inch pole. The width at the handle was to be 4½ inches, and the total weight was to be 6 pounds. So after this meeting where the Tasmanian-pattern axe was effectively crystallised in its design, the proportions were subsequently published in the Australasian Ironmonger newspaper. And it was suggested to blacksmiths in Australia that they should try making axes, prototypes of this axe based on these proportions, which they did do. And there were a number of blacksmiths who came up with prototypes with these proportions. These were the first Tasmanian-pattern axes ever made, and they were made in Australia one at a time by custom blacksmiths. And some were more successful than others. Some, they tried out different subtle changes and found that some worked better than others. So why did the axe design created by Nichols and the UAAA have the particular characteristics that it had? Why does the Tasmanian-pattern axe look the way it does? Why doesn't it have much of a pole, for instance? I think to appreciate why they designed the axe the way they did and why it's such a brilliant design, you have to understand its purpose. If an axeman is chopping some softwood, let's say a softwood log, it's possible to just chop away within a notch. I'm not going to say haphazardly, but in a fairly carefree way, it's possible to chop through that log, through that notch, without an extremely disciplined method. The wood will yield to the axe, even if the chopping technique and the process is not completely regular and the same each time and precise in that way. In the case of really dense and heavy hardwoods, you cannot approach chopping them in that way, otherwise you'd be there all day chopping one log. There is a particular process, and people discovered over time that there's a particular process and technique that you need to use to chop really hard wood efficiently. And that is that you need to chop one side of a notch. You're aiming to get each stroke of the axe overlapping with the previous cut so that you end up severing the fibers of the wood on one side from top to bottom of the log. You're not chopping here, there, and everywhere. You're just making a kind of continuous cut from the top right through, about halfway, right through down to the bottom of the log. Then when you go over to the other side of the notch and you start cutting on that side, as you do the same process on the other side, you want chips of wood where you're severing the fibers on the other side now, the chips of wood to be fractured and thrown out of the cut. So it's almost like a machined cut. It's a very deliberate technique. And that's the only way to cut hard, heavy, dense wood efficiently. And what Nichols and the UAAA did was they took American designs such as the Underhill axe that they loved and they talked about, and other pre-Tassie designs, and they adapted them for this particular way of chopping wood. So, for instance, people say, why does this original Tassie design, why did they minimize the pole? Because they actually said during that meeting, one of the things they pointed out was that they didn't like the fact that American axes had such large poles. Why was that? And my opinion is that what they wanted to do was to make axes which had much thicker bits from the pole to the cutting edge, not taper and come down to be very thin, but to be more of a wedge shape. They wanted to add more steel to the bit in front of the eye, especially to make more of a thick wedge shape, because that's the kind of wedge shape you need to fracture those the hardwood and get it to throw the chips out. But they didn't want to make the axe head heavier overall. So what they did was they shifted steel from the pole into the cheeks of the axe and into the bit. So let's say it's a 5-pound head, it stays the same weight, but you actually have a lot more steel in the bit. And that serves a purpose, as I said, for driving those chips out of the cut. You need more mass, and you also need it to be thicker to do that efficiently. Again, when it comes to the really long cutting edge, the wide cutting edge on the Tassie that they designed, why did they make the cutting edge wider and longer like that? It's because it means that when you overlap your cuts on each side of the log when you're chopping, the longer the sweep of the edge is, the fewer strokes of the axe you need to overlap those cuts to get from the top of the log down to the bottom of the log on each side. So you can cut faster and the process is faster and more efficient. So you want a big wide sweep, and that's why racing axes have an even wider sweep, because you can go even faster in that way. Each feature of this design made sense and had a rational purpose behind it. once word had gotten out through the Australasian Ironmonger publication about this meeting and about this new axe pattern which had been created by the UAAA and Nichols, quite a bit of publicity was generated and quite a bit of interest was generated in the project and what they were doing. Again, Val Quanchi says, for possibly the first time in history, the axe had now come under a complete scrutiny by users, and measurements were given to the manufacturer for an axe suitable for Australian hardwoods. General opinion was that axes for Australian conditions were too thin from the blade to the pole. As a result of all this publicity, 4 American manufacturers supplied their axes for use at a championship woodshop. No English company seemed interested in following the Americans. So this is in reference to the UAAA's next woodchopping carnival the following year in 1893. American axe makers had either been contacted directly, which I think is probably what happened. The UAAA and Nichols had contacted American axe makers, probably, and invited them to submit axes to the next competitive woodshop that the UAAA were holding in Latrobe. And they must also have contacted British makers, but the British makers were not inclined to send any of their axes to the chopping contest. They weren't interested in the publicity that they would get from that, so they didn't send any. And this caused a bit of dismay in Latrobe amongst the members of the UAAA, because they really were hoping, I think, that the first Tasmanian-pattern axes would be made by British makers, because in those days, in the 1890s, the colonies of Australia, they hadn't yet federated. All of those colonies still regarded themselves as part of the British Empire very much. They identified as part of the British Commonwealth. So it was impossible for the axes to be mass-produced within Australia at that time. For instance, in Tasmania, there was no means to mass-produce axes whatsoever. The only way to make axes was individually hand-forging axes, blacksmiths making axes one at a time like that. So there was no hope to mass produce them at that time in Australia. So the next best thing was to have them made by Elwell or have them made by Gilpin or another maker in Britain. But the British were not, they were not at all inclined to get involved in this project at this stage. Now, as early as 1893, it's not clear whether these axes that were sent by these 4 American makers were actually early Tasmanian-pattern axes. We don't know. There's no evidence that the Tassie was being produced by American makers as early as 1893. It's possible, though. It's possible that they sent over some prototype axes that they'd made according to the design that had been worked out at Whitaker's Coffee Palace in 1892. We just don't know. But the next we hear about this ongoing project of getting the Tasmanian-pattern axe mass-produced is in 1896. It was around the year of 1896 that there are records of axes being sold in northern Tasmania. And they're being sold as axes, wide-bladed axes made specifically for cutting Australian hardwoods. Plumb were advertising such axes. And it seems that there were 4 makers, Hubbard, Douglas, Underhill and Plumb, that stepped up and started making these axes around that time. And around 1896, 1897, 1898, there are advertisements of what were called headless axes, which was another way of saying they were axes without poles. They were Tasmanian-pattern axes being sold in that era. So it took a number of years, from 1892 to 1896, to get production going. Clearly, the British makers were not persuaded. After all those years, they still weren't persuaded to mass produce the axe, in spite of all the efforts that Nichols had made, because there is a newspaper article, a small article I found, where it says that H.A. Nichols actually sent one of his Tassie pattern axes to the Prime Minister of Britain, Mr. Gladstone, in 1896. So he even went as far as sending a Tasmanian-pattern axe to the Prime Minister of Britain, and still Elwell and Gilpin and Braids would not manufacture this colonial axe at this point. So the Americans stepped up. They saw an opportunity, they saw a marketplace, they saw an innovative design, and they mass-produced it and began to sell it in 1896. So by 1899, the Tassie had already been a huge success in Australia and had become the axe to have all over the place. All the bushmen wanted a Tassie pattern axe, or what they sometimes called a headless axe. And it was in 1899 that, again, H.A. Nichols and the United Australasian Axemen's Association came up with an idea. Almost certainly it was dreamed up again by Nichols, which was to stage what they called a world competition to find the ultimate axe. So again, this idea that competition would be the means by which inferior axe designs or could be weeded out through competition and the best would be discovered, the survival of the fittest. There's even one article I found which uses Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in reference to the development of tools and the improvement of axes. Competition would be the way to test the mettle of these tools and find out what was best and what wasn't. So it's important to realise that when Nichols set this world competition up and publicised it internationally, his intention was not only to, again, use competition to improve tools and test tools for how effective they were in Australian conditions. His intention was to promote British Commonwealth axe making. He really wanted the British still to become preeminent axe makers in the Australian market. Even though the Americans had been the ones to actually step up and make the Tassie, he still hoped that British makers would be the ones who ended up being successful here. So it wasn't too surprising that in the world competition, when it was held, teams were formed. One team used British axes, another team used American axes and saws. It was also a competition of use of saws. The British makers, Braids and Elwell, had a narrow victory over the American makers. Now, you could say that this outcome was probably intended from the beginning when they first planned the competition. But still, the outcome of this event turned out to be far-reaching. So after this first world competition to find the ultimate axe and saw, what Nichols and the UAAA had done was not only invent, you could say, develop an axe pattern specifically for Australian conditions, the Tasmanian-pattern axe, and they'd founded the rules for competitive wood chopping with the world competition, as they called it, between an American team and a British team. They'd basically also invented the concept which we see today in steel timber sports, which is international teams competing against one another in timber sports. So it's pretty remarkable what they did there in those few years. So from this point on, there was increasing momentum and increasing interest in competitive wood chopping as a sport. It took off throughout the different Australian colonies, and the Tasmanian-pattern axe went from strength to strength, became more and more popular in Australia. I would argue that the Tasmanian-pattern axe actually was one of the very early examples of cultural innovation in Australia, which uh, was spread through all the different colonies before Federation. It was evidence of a shared local culture that was developing in the nation in those early days. It didn't just remain isolated to the Tasmanian colony. It was shared throughout the country. So it was an early sign of a kind of developing consciousness of the people culturally in Australia at the time. So around 1900, one of the things that made the Plumb Tasmanian pattern particularly significant in Australia, where Plumb, from around this time, Plumb started to take control of the Australian market more and more, to dominate in the Australian market with their Tasmanian pattern axe. Now, other makers had made really great Tasmanian pattern axes, but Plumb won out. Plumb really dominated the market. Why was that? Why did Plumb, Plumb's axes were superb quality, but other makers also made superb Tasmanian pattern axes. Well, around 1900, Plumb was a very clever company with marketing and publicity. I think they were ahead of everybody else in that respect. And they developed a concept where they would take wood choppers, axemen, let's say, of note in that time, and they would employ them as representatives. They would be seen using Plumb's axes in competitions, winning competitions with them, and they would promote them as much as possible to the public. So there was a particular axeman from Sprent, not too far from Latrobe. His name was Thomas Petit, and Tom Petit was an early star of Australian woodchopping, one of the early greats of the axe and also the saw. He was a great competitor in the single-handed saw as well as the axe, and I think, he was also a representative for a major American saw maker as well. But Plumb employed him as a travelling representative for them from, I think it was somewhere around 1900, when he was really at the peak of his powers as a competitor. And in the case of Tom Petit, he was a very effective representative. He was particularly good at his job. He was good at speaking, communicating, persuading people about the excellence of Plumb axes. And he did a huge amount to promote Plumb throughout Australia. And I think you can partially put Plumb's success in Australia down to the activities of Tom Petit, and partially because he was such a respected and admired character. And his mentor was Jim Marshall, who was an early pioneer of competitive woodchopping as well in that region of northern Tasmania. And Jim Marshall was regarded as one of the first people to really experiment seriously with different grinds for competitive chopping. And Tom Petit took that on in his own career, and took a very professional kind of approach, a bit more like a modern day, professional athlete in woodchopping. And so Tom Petit, I think he made about 7 trips backwards and forwards to the United States, to the headquarters of Plumb, backwards and forwards in his work as a representative. And this went on. Plumb effectively took over the market in Australia with the Tassie. The Tasmanian-pattern axe gradually became identified with the Plumb company, even though originally they were just one of the makers who initially mass-produced it. And it was around about the year 1908, which coincidentally was the year when the Australian, because by then Australia was a federated nation from 1900 onward. In 1908, Australia got royal assent for its coat of arms for the nation. And in that year, Plumb Fayette developed the first ever single piece solid steel drop forged axe. And that was called the Prima de Labra. And that axe was a big step forward in axe making technology. Instead of a 2-piece axe where a bit was welded to the body, here you had solid steel drop forged. It was a big breakthrough. And in that year of 1908, the Plumb Tasmanian was first mass produced in this new technology. 1-piece solid steel drop forged. This was the precedent which was later taken up by High Test, for example, in Australia, and they manufactured High Test axes with the same process or very similar process that Plumb had pioneered. And that was, you could say, technologically, that was like the final step up until the coming of the invention of the racing axe in Australia. That's another whole story for another time. But for this particular video, I want to bring this to an end in the year 1908 because it is like the final step of a whole phase of development of production of the Tasmanian-pattern axe, which had begun way back in 1892. Bunch of guys sitting around a table in Whitaker's Coffee Palace, Latrobe in Gilbert Street, coming up with this wonderful new axe design for chopping Australian hardwoods. It came all that way to get to 1908, and you've got this new breakthrough, which is kind of like the Tasmanian axe in its definitive form that we think about it today. That was when it took that form. So that is my condensed and abbreviated history of the origins of the Tasmanian-pattern axe in Latrobe, in Tasmania, in the early 1890s through till 1908. I think it's apparent from just that brief overview that H.A. Nichols was the driving force who brought the Tassie and also competitive woodchopping as a sport, as we know it, into existence. And I don't know whether a statue of H.A. Nichols exists anywhere in Tassie today, but it should, I think. I can imagine him standing there as a bronze statue somewhere like Gilbert Street or out the front of the Axemen's Hall of Fame, maybe holding his beloved Tasmanian pattern axe in his hands. And I think that'd be a great thing.